The title of today's sermon, Let America Be America Again, is a reference to Langston Hughes, to that great poem in which he sets forth the many hopes for America, the many ways that America's vision of itself has been violated for so many, particularly for him, calling for America to be America again. And he closes with that hope that America can be America again, that we might actually make it great. My friend Jeremy Rutledge's letter, his poem to that unanswered letter, requires us to hear some of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's most uncomfortable words for us. To accept passively an unjust system is to cooperate with that system. Thereby, the oppressed become as evil as the oppressor. Non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as cooperation with good. The oppressed must never allow the conscience of the oppressor to slumber. And first, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your direct method, your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. And shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. He says, the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. The nation and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. And lastly, the church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state, and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority. Ouch. It is hard to read or hear King's words. Even across half a century, he accuses us, most all of us, of being complicit in the interlocking network of oppression that is woven through American society. I recently watched a video about the Montgomery bus strike, the heroic act of resistance against segregation on buses that was one of the first major events of the civil rights era. I was struck by many things actually, but particularly by the fortitude and determination of the bus strike community, and by the video maker's choice to showcase a white man who served as one of the stand-in taxi drivers for people. That is not a criticism of him. What he did was right and laudable and good, but I was struck by their choice to show us a good white man, someone to project ourselves onto, someone to identify with, because he was an anomaly. Not unique. There were other white people who supported that movement, probably more of them quietly, silently just participating in the strike. But the vast majority of whites in Montgomery did not. We know that because the strike had to go on for over a year. Most whites were complicit. King calls out complicity as being particularly difficult, troubling, and injurious. The silence of our friends, he says, is more harmful than the words of our enemies. Silence has always been a key tool of oppression. Silence, after all, has generally been taken as an indication of consent, of agreement, of going along. It is part of oppression culture. It is part of rape culture. Now, perhaps you're puzzled that I connect these two, but the truth is that all of the various forms of oppression are interwoven. They support each other. They always have, and they will continue to do so. And for those of you who know and face the reality of the bus strike, the mistreatment of black women was what was at the heart of the strike. Not merely its racism, but also its sexism. Black women were regularly abused by white male bus drivers. And a key buttress of such oppression is this: those who stay silent are taken to have consented. Your silence makes you complicit. Why, they ask in court, if a case ever gets to court, why didn't you object? Why didn't you call out? And if you stick your head up and call out, you get abused, harassed, assaulted, threatened to get you to shut up, to default back to silence, to appear to have consented. That is, at its heart, what was going on with lynchings by the Klan, to silence and terrify black people in this country who were beginning to demand to be treated like they were human beings, people equally worthy of being treated with dignity and respect. And it is the same kind of violence that is offered to other people of all ethnicities and colors and genders who are economically disadvantaged. Poor people, working people who have stood up for their rights have also been assaulted and threatened, demeaned, jailed, and murdered. The goal has always been to restore the silence, that negative peace King spoke of, to reimpose the appearance of consent through fear. And Americans have been complicit. It is painful to be called out for complicity. We immediately leap to our own defense. That's not what I meant. That's not what I thought. It's not what I believe. But from our silence, no one would know that. Our silence consents. Our silence is complicit. And complicity is a terrible, terrible accusation because the crime itself is such a shameful one. It says that you defected, that you betrayed. The thing that King tells us is that most of us were and are still complicit. I was not quite 10 years old when King was assassinated. I grew up in a political, or at least politicized, household. I'm sure that murder was part of what came next in my life. The following year, my father ran for Congress. He ran and was, of course, defeated because he was running in a gerrymandered district in California, one that had been carved out by Democrats to pack mostly Republican voters in the LA basin into a single district. Dad ran hard, and he lost. He claims pride in the fact that he did better than any other Democrat had or later did in that district. But he lost, and he realistically was always going to lose. The district was an abomination. It was a violation of our faith's devotion to the idea and ideals of democracy. During his campaign, I got to meet a number of political notables, Alan Cranston, Jesse Unruh, and others. And it's only recently that I began to realize, that they were all complicit. They knew the district was, words matter here, I am choosing mine very carefully, the district was an internment camp for Republicans. It was an internment camp for democracy. They knew. They had to have known that my father's campaign was quixotic, that his chance of winning was essentially zero. Some of them were almost certainly part of the group that drew the district boundaries. Gerrymandering is always wrong. It is a sin against democracy. Now, it is in fact hard not to be complicit. When we go along to avoid trouble, we are being complicit. Sometimes that is a question of survival. The choice is immensely difficult. And we are such rationalizing creatures. We are believers in illusions. We may not even recognize the trap. We may be complicit sleepwalkers. It's only very recently that I recognized that my father was complicit too. He had to have known also. But I know that no one runs a political campaign without first believing, perhaps deluding, themselves that they can really win. We have to lie to ourselves about the odds to get through so much of our lives. But perhaps the most honest thing he could have done would have been to call out the gerrymandering of the district. And I doubt that any of that crossed his mind. Our silence gives consent. Going along accepts the status quo. The bus strikers stopped consenting. They rejected the status quo. They refused to comply, and that required suffering of them. And they did it for over a year. Commitment, devotion, honesty. It was Frederick Douglass who said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters." This struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will. Power concedes nothing without a demand, and it never will. This is the same man who observed, "I prayed for 20 years, but received no answer until I prayed with my legs and bravely walked away from enslavement." Power would never have given him freedom. His demand, his action, made it real despite the law. We here celebrate King. We adulate King. Martin Luther King Sunday is about as reliably a Unitarian Universalist holy day as Christmas and Easter. And we all too easily slide into remembering him and his words only that one day, and we slide into whitewashing him into being a convenient plaster saint, one who does not trouble us, does not demand anything of us, does not accuse us. He was all about civil rights for blacks, and things are, we assure ourselves, so much better. And across the gulf of history and from beyond death, King's words accuse us of silence and complicity because no one who is honest and looks at the facts and the statistics can possibly look at the news filtered through the lenses of wealth and power. We do not see the unfiltered reality of America. Or at the statistics about black employment, black health, black maternal death, black voter disenfranchisement, black incarceration, and police killings of black men and women and trans people, and imagine that things are really good enough yet to even call them better. We are as segregated or more than we were. Black poverty and other indicators are not appreciably better than they were 50 years ago. Less awful? Maybe we can say that. Our society has opted for a kinder, gentler racism, a kinder appearing one gentler on white ears. Too easily, too often, we default back to our disconnected, anesthetized realities, back to the dream of making it, of struggling to achieve the American dream, of not looking at the larger reality which we are all part of, interconnected, remember? Ta-Nehisi Coates warns us that the history of our country is this: the dream of living white. It is not a dream for all people. It is a dream offered, but never truly granted by those who have the power to include, those who have defined what whiteness is and means, which is not the color of your skin. It never has been. That lesson was made clear back when Ben Franklin suggested that Swedes and Germans were swarthy races, and when the porcelain white Irish, people with names like mine, were deemed clearly not white and called inside-out Negroes. Real inclusion, the beloved community, does not exist within the boundaries of power, of privilege, of whiteness. It exists outside of it, and it exists only outside of it. But King was not just struggling against racist abuse of people who looked like him. He was not fighting just for oppressed black people. When he died, when he was murdered, assassinated, he had turned to a larger cause. Recognizing that black oppression was coupled with the economic oppression of poor and working class whites, he had begun to struggle for something beyond race. Recognizing that the oppressions of wealth and class and race have always been used to buttress each other, he had begun the Poor People's Campaign. This act lines him up firmly with Gandhi, who observed that the worst form of violence is poverty. King was demanding decent working conditions, fair, equitable pay, respectable living wages for all people, because economic oppression is and always has been coupled with racial oppression in America. And only by taking on both of them can either of them be ended. And King was ruthlessly criticizing American militarism, denouncing Vietnam, because militarism in this country sends poor people overwhelmingly, and people of color disproportionately, to go and die for the American empire. And so they killed him. The powers that threaten violence and demand silence and consent killed him. Things have not gotten much better since his death. Some of the successes of the civil rights era that we like to point to have been rolled back, and with the objective of suppressing the votes of poor people, and particularly black people and other people of color. The police still kill black people almost without consequences or repercussion, and at rates that rival those of lynchings in the past. King is dead, and the work is and remains unfinished. Not just for Martin Luther King Sunday. There are others of all races and genders and creeds who have taken it up. The Reverend Dr. William Barber has called for the creation of a new Poor People's Campaign, and it is spreading. The first step to making that real in New Hampshire happened just a couple of months ago. But Coates warned his son to avoid the people of the dream, saying that dreamers are the ones who continued to believe the lie at black people's expense. And noting that technology has empowered dreamers to plunder not just the bodies of humans, but the body of the earth itself. Just to be clear, he is speaking of American dreamers, not the people we commonly refer to as dreamers today. This struggle is not for a dream that some of us can achieve and enjoy, resting on the suffering of other human beings. It is for a larger, inclusive vision. The dream is and always has been a lie. The first dehumanizing demand of the dream is that one lie to oneself, embrace the solitary individuality of the grant of whiteness. The first lie that people of that lie have to tell is to themselves. As you embrace this new struggle, do not make the error of this being Barber's campaign and struggle. Make it yours. Yours too. Not yours in whiteness alone, but in a rainbow coalition of community. Do not make Barber and others carry the load. Do not make him a new king whose targeting and assassination can derail the call for voting rights, for an economy that supports all, and for peace. Do not make black people, colored people, LGBT people, and women carry the load, which does not mean do not let them lead. We all have our part to do if we are going to make an exodus from the Egypt we have all been prisoners in, if we are to escape and pursue the vision of a beloved community, one which we can enter into. Do not be silent and complicit. History shows us the terrible price that we all pay when we are silent and complicit. Rise up. Pray and resist. Go out, organize, be loud, and demand that the vision become reality. Give up being people of the dream. Awaken and be people of the vision that could be reality. The bus strike was a small step. King is dead, the work remains, and it remains for all of us to do. Open your eyes and your mouths and demand that the world be the world that all people deserve, not the world that only the deserving can live in. May it be so.